It's difficult to ignore the onslaught predominantly from various religious sites that starts about this time every year. The internet begins to be flooded with articles and videos concerning the supposed origin of many of the present-day traditions associated with Halloween. Some are subtle in their message, whilst others loudly tout it as being nothing short of the birthday of Satan himself. Many people tend to associate modern Halloween with three things: the old Celtic celebration of Samhain, asserting that most of Halloween's customs originate with ancient Samhain celebrations; Satanism, asserting that Halloween's origins are satanic, as evidenced by the many Satanists who use this day to promote their beliefs; and All Saints' Day, asserting that the early church established the holiday to Christianize Samhain. As historian Ronald Hutton notes, until the middle of the 20th century, anthropologists automatically assumed that any festival, however new it actually was, and no matter where it came from, had ancient pagan roots, even if the people celebrating it gave a different story. They were simply thought to be ignorant of its origins. There was a romanticization of rural cultures such that it was thought that the rural folk were holders of ancient wisdom, but simultaneously ignorant that they held such wisdom or that it was ancient. So they needed academics to explain it to them, based on theories that have long been discredited. Halloween is no exception to the above process. Let's delve into the world of historical fact. It seems no matter where you look, from various educational websites to entries in dictionaries and encyclopedias, and even in some scholarly articles, Halloween is always connected to the ancient Gaelic celebration of Samhain. And of course, that comes with the full gambit of all the myths, legends, and lore that have surrounded the holiday for well over 1,000 years. This includes all of the sort of religious paranoia that you hear as well. I'm sure you've heard some of these before. Halloween is the worship of the devil. Halloween comes from heathen roots. Trick-or-treat comes from an ancient pagan custom. Satanic worshipping druids would go from house to house, seeking a virgin to sacrifice. If you complied, they left a jack-o'-lantern outside your door with a candle inside, made from human fat. If you did not comply, a terrible trick would be played on you. The Catholic Church perpetuated the pagan legends with its Feast of All Saints. If you let your kids celebrate Halloween, you expose them to the possibility of demonic possession, etc., etc., ad nauseum. But don't these facts about Halloween's origins prove that it's an abomination? The question that arises is this connection between Halloween and Samhain legitimate, and are all these facts about it actually true? For a serious researcher, perhaps the most difficult aspect of researching these various origins, traditions, and assumed truths about Halloween is sifting through all the data and separating what is historical fact from the myth, legend, and frankly religious paranoia of what is historical fiction. It's not an easy task. Indeed, what makes this even more difficult is that so many of these facts, suppositions, and assumptions are so ill-researched and have been repeated for so long that they have essentially become accepted as truth. As I previously mentioned, one can find these asserted facts, quote-unquote, in everything ranging from various educational websites to entries in dictionaries and encyclopedias, and even in some scholarly articles. What we find after close examination and scrutiny, however, is that the accepted origin of most Halloween traditions or beliefs comes from the latter, historical fiction, rather than the former, historical fact. Completely contrary to what many would have one believe, Halloween is not a holiday that has close ties to the ancient past, nor does it have some pagan antecedent, nor is it a continuation of several ancient pre-Christian customs. The truth is, to say Halloween's connections to ancient Samhain, or anything ancient for that matter, are at best extremely tenuous, would be grossly overstating the facts. A direct connection between Halloween and Samhain has never been proven, least of all with any legitimate satisfactory evidence to back the claim. Halloween just does not have the pagan precedent so many people seem to desperately want it to. Even the concept of trick-or-treat is a relatively new phenomenon, originating from right here in the U.S. from about the 1920s or so, and represents a mix of cultures, capitalism, especially capitalism, and accommodation. Even the wearing of costumes comes from about the same time as well. Modern costuming at Halloween has zero ties to medieval guising, mumming, or souling. Historical similarity does not equate to historical sameness. People kind of tend to forget this. To be completely fair, though, a few customs associated with Halloween do have a very old past, most notably the carving of root vegetables and the various apple traditions such as bobbing for apples. Without going into all the lengthy details, the carving of root vegetables dates to around the 1700s. It's just not historically attested any earlier than that. Bobbing for apples is a fall activity not specifically connected to Halloween, and comes from British women's courting custom, historically attested to about the 1300s. Neither custom is associated with, nor can it be historically attested back to Samhain, or in case of the apple activities, to the Roman Pomona. The simple truth is, what we definitely know about Samhain, facts that can be historically documented, would fill about a page and a half of paper. In other words, not very much. Contrary to repeated insistence in popular sources, scholars can find no clear indication of any ritual or religious practices on Samhain, and certainly none that can be traced to later Halloween traditions. Masks, costumes, trick-or-treating, Halloween games, etc., all either have known traditional Christian origins or simply cannot be linked to anything definitely pre-Christian. The primary source of what is factually known about Samhain comes mainly from the books of the Ulster cycle, but even with these, one needs to weed out the myth and legend from the historical facts. By most accounts, it's only a 3-day celebration. In some accounts, Samhain proper was preceded by 3 days and followed by 3 days, so it was a 7-day. Samhain seems to have been a time to prepare for winter, cull the herds, and celebrate the final harvest of the year. One particular activity that old Gaelic texts seem to suggest was very popular at Samhain was horse racing. That sounds a lot like many European holidays today from October to January. Ancient Gaelic texts also speak of it as a time to pay tithings, gather taxes, and the holding of a judicial assembly, not very much unlike the modern Manx Tynwald Day. There is, by the way, no such thing as the Celtic Lord of the Dead, called, depending on the source, Baal or Baal Samhain, or just Lord Samhain, as it's commonly mispronounced. That bit of utter nonsense comes from a book written in the 1800s, long since discredited. When you get right down to it, nothing is really overly scary about what I just described about Samhain, unless, maybe you had a few unpaid tithes with a local chieftain. I was hesitant to include this, but since it does play a part in the subject of this discussion, let's take a closer look at it. The assertion that Christian All Saints' Day or All Souls' Day replaced Gaelic Samhain. To state it briefly, The date of 1st November for All Saints' Day was practiced in continental Europe long before the date was formally fixed in the Church to November 1st, and long before said change got to what is now the UK and Ireland, which was centuries after the time of Druids and Samhain proper. In addition, most people are not aware that Samhain itself is a movable feast day. The exact date varies from year to year depending on when the autumnal equinox and winter solstice fall. In 2020, for example, Samhain proper fell on the 6th or 7th of November. Samhain seems to have been associated with the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades. It is said to have occurred at the culmination of the Pleiades, when they reached their highest point in the sky at midnight. To assert that the establishment of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day on the 2nd of November was the early church's attempt to Christianize Samhain just does not stand to reason. Think about this logically for a moment. Why would the church change a major feast day affecting all of Western Christendom just to accommodate a small group of Christians who lived on what would be considered at that time some remote group of islands in the middle of nowhere, and this centuries after the Druids and Samhain proper? One scholar has suggested that November 1st may have actually been chosen simply so that the many pilgrims who traveled to Rome to commemorate the saints could be fed more easily after the harvest than in the spring when it was originally celebrated. That certainly does not seem out of the realm of possibility, though this may not have been the predominant reason. I'd be willing to bet that it may have been taken into consideration when this change of dates was made. All three holidays, Halloween, All Saints' Day, and Samhain, share a common date and perhaps a feeling, but that's really about it. Indeed, so much of Halloween feels pagan that attempts to connect those things to ancient Samhain simply feels right. But what about all those Satanists out there? After all, as some people will be quick to remind, the author of the Satanic Bible himself even said, "I'm glad that Christian parents let their children worship the devil at least one night out of the year." Kind of hard to argue about that. Halloween's association with satanic worship and practices, though real, is a very modern phenomenon, about the 1960s to the present, and of course has zero connection to the pre-Christian Celtic holiday Samhain. Most people do not realize that the connection here is no more than about 50 or 60 years old. For those who observe Samhain, Satanists are regarded with just as much disgust and disdain, indeed, if not more so, than Christians regard them. Satanists are responsible for appropriating this day to not only promulgate their belief, but to completely twist the day into something it simply never was. Not to defend them in any way, but again, to be completely fair, it should be noted that most supposed practices of these groups are, again, based upon complete misinformation and supposition rather than actual fact. Many of their assumed and supposed practices stem from the so-called Satanic Panic, a conspiracy theory that swept across America in the 1980s and early 90s. It seems, however, that some Christian denominations are doing their darndest to bring it back. Interviews and testimonies from Satanic Panic holdovers, as well as relative newcomers such as John Ramirez, and so-called self-styled ex-witches, ex-Satanists, etc., are just one of many examples. Others, such as the late Anton LaVey, completely capitalized to the extreme on people's fear and assumptions about Satanism. LaVey's brand of Satanism actually had nothing to do with Satan at all. LaVey was an atheist. His brand of Satanism was an atheistic philosophy and is not at all theological. His infamous or famous, depending on your point of view, quote, which I gave further above, if he actually even ever said it, it's essentially an urban legend that seems to have originated with certain Christian groups. He was probably being sarcastic. He took full advantage of an opportunity to capitalize on some people's fear and assumptions about Halloween and, more to the point, Satanism. Not to defend him in any way, but it should be further noted that LaVey explicitly condemned, amongst other things, the harming of children and animal sacrifice. Again, that's just documented fact. And of course, there are also, without fail, those Christian denominations that seem fixated on associating the holiday with the devil or Satan. As with the association of Halloween with Samhain, for these individuals it somehow just feels right. As in the secular world, the majority of their conclusions come from material which has clearly not been researched, at times rather painfully so, and largely based upon misguided fear and assumptions. These assumptions are repeated over and over again, year after year, until they become accepted as truth. This rhetoric is often accompanied by various Bible passages. Deuteronomy and Ephesians seem to be favorites, which have been taken completely out of historical and cultural context to evidence and confirm their misinformed suppositions. One of the things that one inevitably sees are videos that ask, "Can a Christian celebrate Halloween?" and open that with, "What does the Bible say?" Let's be honest here, the Bible says absolutely zero about Halloween. Accept that. Don't cherry-pick verses taken completely out of cultural and historical context and try to make them fit. Further, the verses used typically refer not to the historical facts concerning the origins of the holiday, but rather the legend, lore, assumptions, and myths that surround it. Many will be quick to argue that Halloween is a day which glorifies evil or does not glorify God. When one participates in Halloween, one is not participating in evil or death per se. Rather, one of the point of the holiday is to mock these things. I think that's a major point that many people seem to completely miss or not quite understand. On another philosophical or psychological level, it allows people to explore their darker side, or psyche, if you will, a time to explore a side of themselves they would not normally expose or perhaps even consider. It's a part of being human. I somehow don't think God would object to humans being human. It's a time to play on a few of the basic or core fears of man, fear of what lurks in the dark and fear of death. The aspects of these fears that people just don't like to think about are now exposed for all to see and experience. A sort of annual self-check to make sure that part of our humanity is still there, so to speak. In the end, most people realize it for what it is. As one commenter puts it from an Orthodox Christian view, this smear campaign against Halloween, in which it has been scapegoated amongst Christians as the ultimate manifestation of secularism and Satanism in contemporary culture, only goes back to fairly recent modern times when certain Christian groups resorted to any fanciful tale to counter the emerging counterculture of the 60s and 70s that they perceived as corrupting youth. Christian leaders since then have clutched us in a guilt trip ever since about a holiday which, prior to this extreme reaction, was indeed harmless for the most part like any other holiday, and had no connection with satanic rituals. It was a cultural festival which, though mischievous at times, really posed no threat to society until we were forced to believe that it did. And finally, as Orthodox priest Father M. Setsema quipped in a 2010 article about Halloween, and let's be honest, modern Halloween for you and me, and even the Wiccans down the street, has nothing to do with virgin sacrifice or black magic. It's about having fun in a costume and eating things your dentist wouldn't approve of. No one was ever possessed by the devil because he or she dressed up for Halloween, or passed out licorice, or read a Harry Potter book. Our modern lives have way too many other avenues for temptation to enter, and these things are the real cause of our spiritual problems. In the end, we are forced to conclude that, like it or not, Halloween is only evil for those who choose to make it so.